Is there any whiskey up to the challenge of replacing Octomore? Let's talk about it. Hey guys, welcome back to Whiskey on the West Coast. My name is Matt, and today we're going to be talking about Bruichladdich enigmatic, super heavily peated single malt Scotch whiskey, Octomore. Now, Octomore is the world's most heavily peated whiskey, with the Octomore 8.3 Masterclass coming in at a whopping 309 ppm, 309 phenol parts per million, which is incredible. But it's a whiskey that isn't for the faint of heart when it comes to buying whiskey on a budget. It is tremendously expensive. On top of this, Octomore sells very quickly in some markets and is very difficult to actually find even a single bottle, let alone be able to afford to buy it. And even though by its own design, there's nothing quite like Octomore, I've put together a list of 5 alternatives to Octomore that you may want to try if you are looking for a substitute. Let's get to the list. Now, the whiskeys on this list, the alternatives, they aren't in a particular order except for the last one on the list. That one is my number one alternative to Octomore. But kicking off this list, we're going to start with probably the most obvious alternative to Octomore, which is the Port Charlotte single malt from the Bruichladdich distillery. Yes, it's from the same distillery as Octomore. It's one of my favorite whiskeys, and one of my favorite Port Charlotte expressions is the Port Charlotte Islay barley. Now, the Islay barley expressions of Port Charlotte in a lot of ways are really kind of like a miniature Octomore 0.3 release. They're using the same malt, it's just cut down to 40 ppm instead of at full strength. It's coming off the same stills, it's aged in the same warehouses. Both are made using Islay barley, which means if you believe in barley terroir and whiskey, it has that same terroir, that same provenance. However, there are some differences. Usually, they're multiple years older than Octomore. Octomore is typically 5 years old unless you have a particular release that's different. The Islay barleys, I believe, are 7, 8. Actually, there might even be a 9-year-old Islay barley release now. They're also diluted down to 50%, which is kind of a standard proof point for Bruichladdich. Again, at a much lower ppm, 40 ppm instead of something in the hundreds. And there's no specific cask type, unlike the 0.3s. The 0.3s usually have a specific cask type for every edition. But one of the biggest differences is the price difference. My last Port Charlotte Islay barley, I believe, cost me about $120 Canadian. Compare that to prices right now on Octomore 0.3 releases in Canada. You're talking about mid 300s, over $400 after tax in British Columbia, where I'm located. That's a massive price difference. If the Port Charlotte Islay barley can get you anywhere near the level of enjoyment and satisfaction as an Octomore 0.3, I think you're doing pretty good. Another option with Port Charlotte, though, is the Port Charlotte Cask Exploration Series. Now, these are, in fact, cask strength like the Octomore releases. And again, they're using the same malt, just cut down, using the same stills, same warehouses, all those sorts of things. It's at 40 ppm instead of the higher in the hundreds ppm range for Octomore. Again, that's one of those main differences with Port Charlotte versus Octomore Spirit. But they're also, again, typically older than Octomore. The most recent release, the PMC01 from Pomerol Casks, that one's 9 years old. There's other ones like the SC01, which is a Sauternes cask. This one beside me is the MC01, that was from Marsala Casks. So they're really focusing on what these different casks do with the Port Charlotte Spirit, but again, offered at cask strength with a bit more age than the Octomores, which are at 5 years old. Now, the biggest difference between these Port Charlottes and the Octomores actually might be how they treat the spirit as it's coming off the stills. The Octomores, they have a very narrow range of cuts, and that's because they're trying to keep the whiskey drinkable while still with these stratospheric phenol counts. They have wider cuts for the Port Charlotte whiskeys, which means you do get a bit of a different flavor profile. But honestly, this might be one of the closest doppelgangers for Octomore out there. I suggest if you're looking for an alternative to Octomore, Port Charlotte Islay barley or Cask Exploration Series, both are great options. Our next alternative to Octomore hails from the GlenAllachie distillery in Campbelltown. It's none other than the Kilkerran heavily peated single malt Scotch whiskey. Now, if you try this whiskey blind, you might think you're actually drinking a certain ex-bourbon Octomore. And that might be because of its massive peat punch at 84 ppm. That's a huge amount of peat. However, this whiskey has a certain fruity yet dirty, farmy, funky, almost cheesy flavor profile that really jives, it really matches some Octomore releases. Some of the Octomore releases are so heavily peated that they do kind of go into that blue cheese, farmy, funky sort of territory. And that's something I really see in Kilkerran heavily peated, except for I get more fruit oftentimes in the Kilkerran heavily peated releases. But again, you have that dirty, heavy peat smoke element along with all those funky flavors. I think it's a phenomenal option as an alternative to Octomore. The biggest trouble is finding it. As it was made by Glengyle, it isn't exactly Springbank taterbait, but it's definitely Springbank adjacent. And quite literally, if you just cross the grounds at Springbank to the other side, you'll eventually get to Glengyle Distillery. As it is, this whiskey is actually really affordable. It only runs about $90 to $110 Canadian in my market where you can find it. It is, again, rather difficult to find at times, but they have released a number of batches, so it shouldn't be quite as hard as finding something Springbank. I think it's a phenomenal option as an alternative to Octomore. Next up on this list of alternatives, we have a relatively new distillery making this list. It's actually the newest distillery from the Isle of Skye, and that's Torabhaig. Now, Torabhaig has released a batch strength of their Alt Glean whiskey. Now, I did try this whiskey, the regular standard drinking strength of this whiskey, while I was visiting Scotland, and really enjoyed it. And while I'm not certain as to the pronunciation of this whiskey, the Torabhaig Alt Glean batch strength is really making some waves, and it really is a great alternative by all accounts to Octomore. Again, I haven't tried this as it's a really recent release, but let's take a look at the stats here. So it's at batch strength, it's bottled at 61.1%. But the big story here is the phenol levels. You see, Torabhaig doesn't gloat about pre-distillation phenol levels measured from the grain. Instead, they're measuring both on the grain, as much of the industry does, like Bruichladdich does with the Octomore releases, but they're also measuring the residual phenols in the new make itself. The malted barley in the batch strength Torabhaig Alt Glean has a phenol measurement of 78 plus ppm, so really incredibly high, only a little bit lower than the Kilkerran heavily peated we talked about. However, they have a residual post-distillation measurement of 22.8 ppm, which that's super cool. Finally, a phenol measurement number that actually matters, because that's what we're actually getting in our bottle is the post-distillation levels. That's really cool. I really wish the industry as a whole would adopt that as a standard, because it would be a lot more useful than the phenol levels that were on the grain before it was distilled. Either way, it also clocks in at about 60 months of age, which is 5 years old. Octomore's 5 years old. This Torabhaig is as well. That's an age statement that's held by most Octomore releases. Again, not all. They do have the 10-year-olds and a few others out there. This has yet to come to Canada, but early reports suggest it is a good counter to the Octomore. What's even better is that it's priced very competitively, at least in the UK, at roughly about $130 Canadian or 75 pounds. It suggests it's likely worth a punt if you enjoy Octomore or are looking for a cheaper alternative to Octomore. I know I'll be giving it a shot once it arrives on our shores. The next whiskey on this list is yet another new type of whiskey, but not from a new whiskey distillery itself. I'm talking about the Michael Tor, the Turbo, heavily peated single malt Scotch whiskey from the GlenAllachie distillery. Yeah, this is heavily peated GlenAllachie whiskey. Now, GlenAllachie is known for their unpeated distillate, which is probably why they wanted to have another brand name to represent the heavily peated single malt Scotch whiskey that they're making here. Now, the name Michael Tor, the name of that brand, actually means big pursuit in Scots Gaelic. And this isn't the first peated whiskey released by GlenAllachie. That was a 4-year-old cask strength that they released, I believe, last year. But it is the first large-scale release of peated whiskey. So they had 4 different releases that came out in this new range. Why do I single out the Turbo as the one that's the best alternative to Octomore? Well, the other 3 releases were all peated at about 35 phenol parts per million. The Turbo, however, is at 71 phenol parts per million. Yeah, that's heavily peated, I would say. Now, it's also aged for 5 years. Does that Sound familiar? In virgin oak and Oloroso casks, and it's bottled at 50%. So kind of like the Port Charlotte there. This is yet another whiskey that hasn't yet to make its way to Canada, but I'm terribly intrigued, and I really want to get my hands on a bottle once it gets here. It's got all the hallmarks of a star alternative to Octomore, and the release price on the Turbo in the United Kingdom is actually only about £51, which if I did the straight equivalency to Canadian dollars, that's $90. That is an outrageously good value for something that could be a fantastic alternative to Octomore. Before we get to the number one alternative to Octomore on this list, I wanted to shout out a few honorable mentions. I'd be remiss not to mention Ardbeg's own entrance into the super heavily peated single malt Scotch whisky arena, and that would be their Hypernova and Supernova releases. Now, peated to 100 ppm, the Ardbeg Supernova release was first launched in 2009 with subsequent releases in 2013, 14, 15, and 19, I believe. Now, 2022, Ardbeg took things up yet another notch for their range by releasing the Hypernova at 170 phenol parts per million. Not quite the withering heights of that Octomore Masterclass 8.3 at 309, but still really friggin' heavily peated. Now, I haven't tried the Ardbeg Hypernovas and Supernovas as they were extremely limited and super freaking popular. However, if you wanted an Ardbeg release I can recommend as a heavily peated whiskey, that'd be the Ardbeg Corryvreckan. It's peated to 55 phenol parts per million. And I have to give it a wee shout out to this gem in the Ardbeg range because I think it is a beautiful whiskey and its deft use of heavy peat as well as sweet French oak spice. The type of peat is from Islay. It's actually all malted at the Port Ellen maltings, but it's more verging on a like asphalt, dock tar, melting rubber, and big plumes of smoke. And no doubt it's heavily peated, but just in a different way than Octomore. Still, I think it's one of the best alternatives to Octomore in a heavily peated whiskey. And in Alberta, you can pick it up for about $120 Canadian. BC is a lot more expensive, over and above $200. So I wouldn't recommend picking it up in British Columbia. My other honorable mention I want to mention is the Longrow non-age stated release. And I'd recommend that for a lot of the same reasons I recommend the Kilkerran heavily peated. It's peated to about 50-55 phenol parts per million as it has 2 days of peat smoke to dry the barley at Springbank. However, it doesn't quite pack the same sort of wallop of peat as Octomore does, but it's farmy, funky, dirty peat smoke balanced with some fruitiness that does a lot of heavy work with the palate. It's really a fantastic, engaging whiskey. If we had an easily acquirable cask strength version of it, I think we'd be set up pretty well to actually have a great alternative to Octomore there. The Kilkerran heavily peated is at cask strength, which is why it's just a bit better alternative to Octomore than the Longrow non-age statement. Still, it's a lot easier to get than a Springbank release, and it only runs about $90 Canadian. I think the Longrow non-age stated release is a fantastic honorable mention on this list. We're at the end of the list. We're to the number one alternative to Octomore, super heavily peated single malt Scotch whiskey. I want to thank you for watching this far, guys. I want to thank my Patreon members for all their support and supporting me in that fantastic and significant way. If you're not aware, I do have a new Patreon membership page where I post Patreon exclusive review videos and other content that's just getting started up now. If you want to find the link for that, you can find it in the link of the description of this video down below. Outside of that, guys, I love the comments. If you can comment down below what is your favorite alternative to Octomore, if you have one, it'd be interesting to see what you guys come up with, and if you come up with anything different than what I've put on this list. Thank you once again for watching. Like, share, and subscribe, and keep the comments coming. I really do love the engagement. My number one alternative to Octomore is gonna have to be the Laphroaig 10 cask strength. I feel like this is an obvious choice, and it's not because the peat comes off in the same manner as Octomore, but I can't think of another whiskey that comes off as heavily peated as Laphroaig 10 cask strength outside of maybe Octomore itself. Some will even say that they think Laphroaig 10 cask strength is actually heavier on the peat influence than Octomore, possibly because of the way it's made. Now, Only one of the whiskeys that might actually taste peatier and smokier than Octomore, again, is this Laphroaig 10 cask strength. However, the phenol level is actually lower at 45 phenol parts per million. You can see why these measurements get a little tricky because they don't tell you the full story about what a whiskey tastes like. Now, phenols aren't anything. Laphroaig emphasizes all those bigger, brasher, earthy, seaside, medicinal bonfire smoke notes that we love. And much like there's nothing truly like Octomore, there really isn't anything like cask strength Laphroaig either. It's its own beast. This is one of the most natural contenders for the title of best alternative to Octomore, but it really should be appreciated as its own unique entity. It has its own beauty altogether by itself. Still, I think it's probably the best alternative to Octomore at present. Well, thank you once again, guys, for joining me. I hope you have some of these bottles in your collection. Let me know again, what is your favorite alternative to Octomore? Please come back and join me again in the future. Until next time, from the West Coast, Sláinte.